The Blockchain New Zealand podcast is brought to you by Easy Crypto. 5 years ago, a passionate bunch of Kiwis created Easy Crypto in New Zealand to enable Kiwis and others to buy and sell cryptocurrency. The Easy Crypto website is simple and straightforward. They have heaps of great educational content that caters to both beginners and experts and are very transparent about fees. You can buy crypto with New Zealand dollars or with your credit card and get crypto sent directly to your wallet. Investing in cryptocurrency can of course be risky, so always do your own research. Visit easycrypto.com to start your crypto journey today. Are you good to go?
Yeah.
David, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming down from, where are you based in? Newmarket? Parnell, the one right beside Newmarket. Coming down to AUT here today. I've been listening to some of your work lately. I'll call it your work. I don't know if it's actually your work, but I'm sure that it's a important part of you. And so maybe I'll just let you decide where you want to get started. I've kind of got like 3 topics on my list here. And the first 2 are ternary thinking and over unity systems. And so I don't know which one might come first, or might be better to talk about first. So I'll let you decide. You decide that. Can you tell us about ternary thinking over unity systems? And then we're going to, spool that into any blockchain chat.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good. So ternary thinking, I call it, so my body of work I've been working on is called Trinity. And so the concept behind that is binary infinity. So infinity in binary. So that's what Trinity means, is binary infinity. So where it gets confusing is that it's binary plus infinity to make the 3 things, whereas binary in truth is kind of one thing. So it's a way of thinking applied to problem solving for basically anything. And so I've used it. So my body of work is called Trinity, and I've got a number of projects I'm working on that have utilized this method of thinking for problem solving in different contexts. One of those is a software platform, but in truth, it can be utilized to create any form of over unity system. So an over unity system, meaning that, well, you can't really have something that's over unity, but it's a system that that draws a surplus beyond what is drawn, that produces a surplus beyond what is drawn. So if you think of a portfolio of wealth generating assets and they yield a 1.5% return, that's over unity, or a 10% return, that's over unity. But it's that applied to any kind of system, human system, software, hardware.
So binary plus infinity, right? Doesn't infinity include binary?
It does, but it's about looking at it in a dualistic way as though it were separate. Because the truth is that everything is just one thing, but within our reality, we also experience separation. So it's about leaning into the illusion of separation and polarity and using it in that context as if it were a separate thing.
Separate as in like one is separate from 0?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And you said that 0 and 1 could kind of be the same thing. How so?
So 0 and 1 meaning that if you have an absolute presence of everything and an absolute void of all things, it's the same thing.
The same thing.
The beginning and the end is the same.
Okay. Kind of like the closed circle.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, I mean, binary to me, right, as a computer scientist, binary, very black and white.
Of course.
There's another binary term. And so it kind of like is this culmination of all of this abstract thought through hardware that we've been able to create in this world around us, in this digital world around us. What are some so if that's an obvious binary example, what are some examples of infinity or are there any binary examples from nature?
Yeah, so if you look at blockchain, I mean, it's a great example of using ternary thinking to solve a binary problem. So in this context, you're not looking at creating infinity. You're looking at leaning into the reality that infinity exists. So for this to be true, the equal and opposite must also be true from a singular perspective. So binary is dualistic, infinity is singular. It's just one perspective. And so an all-encompassing perspective. So in binary, as an example, if you have a monolithic piece of software and it won't scale, then the solution to that pressure is fragmentation. And so there you see a blockchain. So the solution to something remaining centralized and singular is to fragment its base elements. And that's what enables it to continue being monolithic, to continue being singular, but also totally fragmented.
So monolithic, would this be like big tech, something like that?
Yep. So to give you some context, the problem I've used it to solve was, you've got blockchain and this massive, community and culture surrounding it, but it's technology driven, rather than behavior driven. You can't just design a UX and then build up to it. You have a dependency on the way that it works, which is very unique. In Web 2, you develop the user interface and you build up to meet it exactly how the user wants to use it. And so the problem, using ternary thinking, I said, okay, well, how do we utilize the extremes of both? And that is to build down towards blockchain, and for blockchain to build up and to meet somewhere in between. And so what we're seeing now is, because ideally we want for it to be all inclusive, it has to be able to adapt to the user, like wholly. And so what we're seeing now is, so I pushed WordPress to its absolute limit, exhausted it, because its superpower is how fine you can, a niche you can build something for. So you could have like 100 different plugins, they're all virtually exactly the same thing, but there's a slight difference.
And you see that, right? When you search for like an ad blocker or something, right?
Yeah.
So many options.
Yeah. And like the quality control is horrendous, but the beauty of WordPress is that your risk profile is your own. You determine whether the risk is worth the reward of putting some random plugin with no reviews in your system. I push that to its absolute limits. And it's like, okay, can we use WordPress to launch and scale a global SaaS company?
Yep.
And so that's the challenge. And so the solution became, so we're not going to stop. We're going to keep pushing. And the solution came to the point where we had to build it headless to make it continue working. And we had to build it on microservices. You probably know how microservices work.
I know a bit about microservices, yep.
Yep. So the plugin becomes a microservice. Yep. Now, the next evolution of that we're just seeing now is event-based microservices. Now, an event is a completely new way of looking at how to build in Web 2, which, and now with AI, you can teach it how to reconcile conflicts in potentially different languages to create an event-based solution. And so you have an event that's coming from above, and you have a node or a smart contract or whatever it is. That's where they're beginning to meet in the middle. And so you can now have potentially the unity there of event-based Web 2 stuff and blockchain coming up to meet it where it is.
So, I mean, this is Ethereum, right? Ethereum is an event-based system, right? You have to ping Ethereum to find out what happens, or if you're writing a smart contract, you have to emit an event so that we know the updated state. And that is different from what we're used to in Web 2.
Yep. But I think, obviously, a lot of integration has to go on and a lot of reconciliation, but I can see where founders are working at the moment. They're constantly pushing those boundaries. I had one just recently come in who's developed a model that takes a monolithic piece of software and begins to translate it into event-based architecture. Yep. So I can see that gap between both is getting less and less.
And so the monolithic piece, is that also like a walled garden, like in terms of permissions? You can't just join and play.
Well, that's another problem for Ternary. So if you look at the issue over data sovereignty at the moment,
huge, it's
massive. And if you look at how OpenAI have developed their model, scraping public information and producing a singularity. and then commercializing it. It's kind of
and
like
saying, oh, by the way, we're not open source anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And then like asking for regulators to help. I mean, the absence of a duty of care in that space is concerning to me. But if you were to go at it again and say, okay, we had a crack at this, how would we do it now? We actually want to incentivize people to pull their capability. And that's what we want in the singularity. But in the singularity, we want to divorce it from the thing that you can own, which is your culture, your behavior, your events. So if you think about the way that you behave in the world, it's a series of events strung together in a macro.
Okay.
So imagine a stack of events, and the thing that you have sovereignty over is how you behave. But you can't own the alphabet. So if you have a singularity, you need to divorce it from the interpretation of the omniscient layer, which is the all-knowing layer. And it needs to be moted and, trustless. And I think the space we're moving into, you can see that that's definitely a viable option, as long as we can crack the event-based scenario.
And in terms of the data sovereignty piece, in terms of the at the web level of owning your own data or being able to selectively release your own data, is this a pathway to tie into helping with that?
Yeah, exactly. So what we're seeing now is we're seeing a move towards constitutional AI, which is decentralized intelligence that could potentially be stored on your phone using a cold wallet-like system, and whereby you own all the events, whether it's contained within a smart contract or whatever it is. I don't know how that works, but it's permission-based. And so, but ideally what you'd want is you'd want a tokenomics structure that's incentivizing the sharing of knowledge. And so your data is growing in value as an asset over time based on your reputation of how useful your knowledge and wisdom is, and how readily you share it with the community.
I mean, this sounds like things people are at least aware of and working towards, right? In terms of protecting your reputation, or marketing, they call it your brand, and also being able to carry it with you and selecting how it leaves your device.
Yeah, and that's the essential component. Is if you have the power to wield your sovereignty, to bond or exchange information, value, then you also need instantaneous access to revoke it. And so, we have to move towards, there has to be a centralized dashboard where you can see these are all the ways that I've wielded my power and my sovereignty, and this is no longer valid, so I want to revoke that. And it should just be like unchecking a box. And interestingly, in common law, which is very different to statute law, the right of revocation is without question or justification. So in truth, the will of the human being stands above statute, and we can revoke any power that we've given or any authority we've given in the moment.
Certainly we can revoke anything by our will, but that might not be the end result. That might not be the outcome that is achieved. If we're locked into an ecosystem, we can say, I want to leave. I'm revoking here, the authority to leave. I grant it to myself, but then I turn around and say, oh shit, it's the only thing that's available to do what I needed to do.
Exactly. And so you're either incentivized to create something new, a new solution, or that you have to reconcile the issue. What is the reason that you want to revoke it? And ideally, that's what we want to do. And that's a key part of self-governance and self-sovereignty, is that I'm not going to depend on an arbitrator to arbitrate this conflict that I have. I'm going to go directly with that human being and reconcile it as an adult. And so, I think you have this massive push towards self-governance, but I think people don't really understand what that truly means, is to be totally self-sovereign. If you want someone else to do something for you, there's some authority that you have to delegate or defer to someone in order to receive that help. And so we're so averse to giving our power away. And, the extreme of that is that we've become averse to receiving the help that we actually need that would, catapult us forward.
So in terms of giving your power away, are you talking about like in an extreme case here, perfect self-sovereignty. I'm like researching my own brand of cancer and figuring out how to treat myself or my family, and like doing it myself and figuring out how to make some radiation drugs and things like this.
Yeah.
And like, obviously that's not going to happen. I haven't dedicated my life to it yet, and it's not going to happen in time to save my family members. So how do you say I'm giving authority to the doctors?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things you can do with your authority. And so the lens I look at it through is that you're actually totally responsible for your life. At the base layer, no one else is responsible for your life. You know, in nature, a meteor could come and your life could be taken. So there's no right or entitlement to life. It's a privilege. So in that context, I'm the only one that's responsible for the quality of my own life. And so
that takes the pressure off me. Then it's all on you.
Yeah, exactly. But if I want to improve the quality of my life, it's inevitable that at some point I'm going to have to defer the authority for an aspect of my care. So in this scenario with cancer, it's a great scenario. I know that alone I am incapable of achieving this. And so I want to defer the authority for this aspect of this project or this care to the doctor or to the nurse. Understanding that I'm still responsible despite what they may do. They might make a mistake. They might, so, you know, they're part of nature. That a meteor comes, it just comes. You don't blame the meteor.
I think you've said that very well. This idea of like responsibility. We spend so much time like having commissions and inquiries and, you know, saying, you know, the health system is rubbish and we have to fragment it and put it back together, right? And like the whole way through, the responsibility is just like everyone's pointing at someone else.
Yeah.
And I guess you could say that about a lot of our institutions or our systems. Where does this idea of self-sovereignty and deferring authority in terms of like the rule of law, how do you see that?
So in the rule of law, if you operate purely in statute, which is I see as binary law, it's deterministic.
What does statute mean?
A statute means you know, typical legislation.
Yeah. Okay.
As opposed like for commercial entities. So a commercial entity that's bonded by statute is a legal person and a company, anything that's incorporated. And then the natural person is what sits in common law. So those are two different things. Your will is what sits in common law, and your agency is what sits in statute. The power to speak and then the power to act. So, you know, as a human being, you've got, you know, you have a unified voice, but each cell has its own agency. And so it's kind of that same thing.
We just had Kirsten Patterson on the podcast, the chair of the Institute of Directors, and we were talking about DAOs, and she said, well, in New Zealand, you have to be a natural person to be able to, I'm not sure if she used the word constitution, but to run a company. And so as of yet, DAOs are not going to happen.
Yeah, well, you have to be a natural person to run a company. Yeah, well, you have to be a legal person to set up a company. The natural person is not recognized under statute.
Under statute, okay.
But in a scenario, you know, common law stands above statute, so the will stands above the agency. And so, if you know, in a scenario within which you can convert a common law will, I call it a living will. You know, in the will you can have
not the legal document that you give your lawyer, not that.
Well, it's an expression of your will.
You're talking about like personal agency, that type of will?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, not a physical document. So it is my will that X, Y, Z, A, B, C. You know, that stands above, you know, statute. So in a scenario within which we can turn that common law will into a principal asset and then bond statutory assets to it, it stands above regulation, legislation, everything. So and you can see that it's edging closer and closer towards that kind of thing.
Do you see blockchains as being a tool to enable some of this, or is it just like another step in technological progress?
Absolutely, blockchains will be essential for this. Yep, absolutely. Whether or not blockchains hang around for the long haul, I'm not sure. And that's based on, you know, what I'm seeing in with geospatial AI and you know, I had a founder come in the other day who's built a serverless blockchain. And I'm getting the demo this week. So I'm very interested to see how that's possible. I can't figure out how it's possible in my mind yet. But I'm seeing what the guys are doing in the geospatial kind of spatial web space as well. And there are interesting alternatives to, as micro transactions become more and more fine, the gap between a verified transaction gets smaller and smaller. You're getting closer and closer to an AI solution being possible, especially in context of event-based architecture, because there's another founder in the ecosystem who's come up with an algorithm for perpetually refuting and conjecturing within an event, and that's an AI kind of thing. So if you can have an event that's perpetually attacking itself and then hardening those vulnerabilities within a very small window of time, and that's verifiable, that's getting it's almost becoming a singular way to solve the problem rather than a fragmented way. So these are just little symptoms I can see of where things are moving.
The adversarial effect there, is this similar to how like the chess algorithm gets better by playing itself?
Yeah. Exactly. And, we've got an incredible model in our ecosystem right now. Founders, they've got an adversarial model and they've used a game of rugby to demonstrate its prowess. So it's a digital twin of a game of rugby. It ingests games of rugby, and then it's an oracle. It becomes an oracle and predicts that if this rugby player was 2 centimeters taller or this much heavier. But what it's actually doing is it's a singularity that's split into binary to play itself at the game of rugby, and it's attacking itself and then getting better and better at defense against premeditated attack. And so the closer those moments are together of those microtransactions, the more difficult it becomes to penetrate.
So this is a strategy game as opposed to a betting outcome type of algorithm.
Well, it's a matter of context, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. Will it be live before the World Cup?
Yeah, well, they the rugby model is completely finished, and they're actually talking to the NZRFU about it. So, but their big players, the NFL, so they've almost finished the defensive model. For just defense.
I mean, I don't know how something like the NFL, right, is very technical. Everything's set plays. Most of it is set plays, and I wonder what the crossover there is from like the video game, like the NFL yearly video game that gets put out, in terms of like how you run your event tracking in a scenario like that. Like you've got a lot of moving parts there, right? You got 20 people on the field, set positions, and in terms of microtransactions, I think this is still one of the optimum pristine use cases for blockchain. But as you said, once we get the verification between transactions to come down, we can start running more and more events through the system.
Exactly. And that's, when you think about, the flicker rate of a screen, in that scenario where because at the moment, the smallest gap I've seen is 1 second. And the technical lead is saying to me that he can go way beyond that if he had the capacity to develop it. But there's no need to go that deep right currently. So in that scenario, let's look at an AI oracle like the guys that have developed the rugby model. In that context, it's ingesting 2D videos, which are basically 2-dimensional images, frames stitched together. It can ingest that, interpret it, and then predict the future. That's basically how your eye works. And so you're seeing a potential solution for vision for a robot that can, behave and react in the moment. So it's actually really exciting to see where this is heading, especially with microtransactions. And I think blockchain will be a key component of that.
Okay, I mean, that's interesting. So you can take your 2D frames, use some recognition to figure out what's where.
Yep.
Take the next frame or the next couple of frames, and then be able to use the AI to predict what's happening next. I mean, that's a cool use case, and that's how OpenAI does its thing, right? It's generating what it thinks could be the next token in line. based on, as you said before, based on basically scraping everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so people say, oh, it's just predicting what word you're going to say next, but it has to be able to interpret the meaning of that in context to be able to predict that word. So it is highly intelligent at the same time.
Yeah, you get a feeling of this when you use ChatGPT. I haven't used the others enough to know, but I like how they display what's happening, and then you can see the AI going back and either correcting itself or having a think round to give you better context. And one of the pro tips is that if you're not getting the answer you want, you can just ask it to try again. And it's going to use the previous context the previous answer it gave you to try to improve upon. And so it's not deterministic in that way. You're not going to see the exact same outcome.
Yeah. It's deterministic if you understood all of the meaning of all of the events.
Okay, yeah. Good point. Yeah.
So it's non-deterministic because there's no way of doing that.
What is a geospatial web?
So geospatial web, I would say, you've seen the new goggles that Apple have announced.
Sure, yeah.
The spatial web, I would say, is the emergence of a platform that enables digital agents, like the event-based scenario. It enables a digital agent to be immutable, and then for that to be bonded to an avatar, whether the avatar is just a visual representation, like a persona, or whether it's an application, like front end to a software application. You can have an infinite array of avatars that are trusted because they're bonded to an immutable event, block, node, whatever it may be. And what we're seeing is that the tolerances of geolocation, so let's say a scenario where you're ingesting 2D information and you're projecting a digital twin of the environment that you're ingesting. As microtransactions get finer and finer and smaller, you're getting closer to a scenario where you can have a live, in the moment, digital twin of the environment. And the only limitation is the sensoring technology that's feeding it into the oracle. So I'd say that's where the spatial web is heading. And in that scenario, you have a digital agent inside the digital system that can potentially control a hardware asset outside of the system, like a swarm. So I would say this is likely where this is going to head, as long as we can reconcile the issues of OpenAI and that being the de facto standard for the singularity.
I mean, this idea of digital twinning, like, is there going to be, benefits to humanity from this, or is this just something else that we can do that might possibly have some cool applications? Like,
I'd say the coolest application of this is, a project I'm talking with a group of founders at the moment, which is to use iwi land, dormant iwi land, build a factory and make it entirely autonomous, with robots and then target offshore manufacturing in China and see if we can make autonomous manufacturing for one thing compete against a slave labor market and bring it back to New Zealand. In New Zealand, we've got so much land, sprawling land, highly underutilized. And so,
what do you mean? I can plant pine trees and get my carbon credits or whatever, my carbon capture?
Yeah, exactly. So, so a scenario like that, if it's a trustless system, and you've got trusted digital agents controlling the physical agents, and the tolerances on the geospatial are really fine. I think the finest tolerances I've seen are 3 millimeters currently. So it's not like surgical, but it's kind of inevitable that it will get to that point as well. Blockchain would be a key component of that, or whatever we call it at that point. It's kind of a fusion of a lot of different things.
So that you have your immutable trust base to go from.
Exactly. If you can say that I trust that system, like implicitly, that's the key to surrendering and allowing it to have the agency that you actually want to defer.
What happens when it all goes wrong, David? What?
Well, if we can't trust it, it will. It has to be moated. The base, the omniscient layer has to be moated and dependent on a power source that only human beings have. We've got to be very deliberate about how we build something like this.
So you're a tech advisor. Are you advising people to like do this moded approach, and then like how do you interact and like eventually bring down the walls or whatever it is to get folks in and use it?
Well, it's a challenge being an advisor because you have no teeth. Like if it were me, I would. You may want to talk to so and so. So often they don't take your advisement because they're undercapitalized and they need to commercialize something. So that pressure is always there.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that the ones that are the mega geniuses that I'm working with, their model is moated and they have analog phones. Like they don't use smartphones. Like they're not stupid. They're not going to wait for regulators to tell them what they need to be doing. So, and this is a big challenge for them because this, a VC auditing an opportunity for something that's so bleeding edge, they're just never going to really understand what it is, how special it could become. So yeah, I help to bridge that gap as well between a VC and the founders.
Yeah, difficult place to be. It's hard from an academic point of view to do some research, write up a paper, and explain it with both a coarse and a fine grain language to meet your audience or to even be able to pick your audience. And so I can appreciate how you've got something that you're sure is going to work. All you need is, I don't know what the minimum would be. All you need is $1 million. Why can't I raise $1 million?
Yeah. It's but going back to over unity, it's like if you were to look at the economy surrounding the metabolizing innovation, it needs to come from a surplus. That curiosity and that fail fast stuff that has to happen, where you're in that mode of experimentation, where you're creating a conjecture that makes sense based on what is known, but I need to refute that repeatedly, and you're in that fail fast mode where the failures are what you're celebrating until you get to success. You can't constrain that to time. Could take 5 years, could take 10 years. And so that has to come from a surplus. And so it has to come from wealth elsewhere. And I think some of the strain that we see in the ecosystem is on funds in New Zealand are undercapitalized. Like let's say the next OpenAI did emerge through the New Zealand ecosystem. There's not really a fund in New Zealand that could go, here's the 5 billion to shoot for the stars.
You mean existing funds that are earmarked for this type of work? Or
Yeah. We're not expecting the next unicorn to come through New Zealand. There's a global ecosystem that can metabolize it. But, I'd say unless a founder goes through a really intensive accelerator, incubator, pre-seed, gets them ready for seed, and they go through that global path, the wealth generating asset at the end, it's not benefiting New Zealand, unfortunately.
So in terms of an over unity system, like if you're a startup, you might go years, before reaching funding levels, maybe even before going to market and being profitable. Is this an under unity? Then you come up and then you're over unity.
Yeah. Well, if you think about, if you like a binary perspective is you create debt in order to go forward. But the ternary perspective is you zoom out and look at it in the singularity, and the loan came from some surplus elsewhere. So there's surplus wealth somewhere that is willing to be deployed for stuff. So debt is just an enabler for the surplus to move around. Innovation in terms of how we structure the flow of capital, and I think more debt-based scenarios whereby, I'll give you an example. We've got a founder who built an insane proof of concept autonomous drone, validated the proof of concept. He's gone through the phases, got MOUs, built the version 1.5, and he's now into version 2, which is the product, which is the version that can be dismantled, go de-risk the value chain for manufacturing, and then can be manufactured. And he's managed to get all the capital that he needs, but through the valley of death, through getting product market fit, that's the most challenging piece for any founder. And there's a void of capital because the VCs don't want to invest in de-risking it, rightly so. the founder hasn't got any capital to de-risk it, and so the stagnant situation happens. But if you talk to that founder and say, would you put up the house? Yep, you get a second mortgage. Would you put up the value of the assets, the intangible assets, as collateral for someone to provide you a loan? Yep, absolutely. And so then you have this issue of they don't have the capital, and VCs don't want to pay to create the patents early on. They want product market fit first. So that's kind of the void that I play in, and trying to pull both these parties together. Very challenging. Can be heartbreaking to see a founder in that state. And frankly, they come to Callaghan because we provide grants, and they may meet the criteria, they may not, and if they don't, and we can see the potential, then we try and metabolize that, by providing connections, expertise, workshops.
What is the de-risking here that you talk about in terms of what you said about supply chain for that example? But in general, what is de-risking?
De-risking is product market fit. So one thing is validating the technology. Yep, this is innovation. It's innovative. It's something new, and it solves a problem. But product market fit is about the commercial viability of solving that problem in the market. And so, the strategy, the business model, the operating model, it needs to make sense as a wealth generating vehicle. If we pump money into this and shoot for the stars, is it going to become self-reliant, wealth generating? Is it going to need another injection of capital? And unless you can foresee those things, then you can't align yourself with the right VC. It's like look at Xero as an example. They operated at a loss for so long because they know that was their operating model. They can align themselves with VCs that understand that operating model, and they can have the injections of capital at the right time to see them through the valley of death. Product market fit is the enabler.
Valley of death, yeah.
Yeah. Product market fit is the enabler. It provides the insight to inform that, this is how it's going to work. And in 10 years, it's going to be self-reliant, wealth generating. And so we will have accumulated an asset of this much value. So it's all based on valuation the whole way through.
Let's say you want to build the biggest rocket humanity has ever built, and you want to put humans on a planet, let's say Mars.
Yeah.
Right? How do you convince investors? How do you sell this? And it seems pretty risky, building giant rockets, sending people to Mars.
Yep.
What would you? I know I'm making you think on your feet here. What would you? How would you couch this?
I think about this all the time, and it's quite simple. It's proof of concept. Align a very small project as a proof of concept that solves a problem, that is viable, that is aligned to the bigger thing. So what is the smallest thing you can do here and now without needing anything else that you can stand up now? Try and stand it up, and if there are gaps, ask for help. But it's always about standing up the small thing that could evolve into the big thing. And to me, this solves the problem of a VC not understanding the big thing, but they understand the story around the small thing, and that's valid, and that's what they're backing, not realizing that in truth, the visionary behind it knows that we're going to be on Mars one day. And now, until you've got, you're like Elon Musk, the equity of his brand as a name, that's what he's leveraging at this point.
Yeah.
The whole world trusts that he's going to put us on Mars. We actually don't doubt him, but there's a million reasons to. So when you've got that much equity in your brand as a human being, that's what you're leveraging. And so you negate all the risk or the de-risking because people trust that you can solve the problem.
Yeah, we trust that he can hire brilliant people to follow through.
Yeah.
And we also trust that he's going to be working until he dies.
Yeah. Man, imagine if there's a huge amount of risk and the dependency on him in the way that he works. It's a shame. I think it's not sustainable. but he'll upload his consciousness into a robot or something.
Yeah, that's right. There's going to be some version of him living for a long time.
Yeah.
I've got on my list here something called Beyond Blockchain. So you are the first person that I've heard of that is in agreement, as you said, with blockchain as a good technology to help us moving forward, but that also has seen or can foresee, maybe call it the end of blockchain or the next thing that's going to come up and replace or supersede blockchain.
Yep.
Are all the folks that are committed that blockchain is going to survive long term and be a worthwhile pursuit?
You mean like crypto, or you're thinking the technology?
I come from a technology point of view. You can't completely disentangle it from crypto, though. So yeah, together.
Yeah. So I would say that what I witness is that when you have binary and you push it to its limits, then and it's a monolithic singularity. It's one thing. Fractures, like in nature, cell splits. They go around on their own, and then they realize they need help. They bump into each other. A single cell organism becomes, a multi-cell organism, and a singular membrane is wrapped around it. And each cell continues to have agency, but it is unified, and so it's wrapped. And so this is what I foresee, and it's along the lines of, event-based architecture, whereby if a Web 2 monolithic piece of software is built event-based in an event-based framework, then you can protect the event as a singularity and as a node, but the events become the chain, you see. So to say that blockchain is going to vanish, what do we call that? Is it still blockchain?
I mean, I'm sure it'll still be around, still be possible to use or build with.
Yep. And it will probably be, there's always going to be a network, like whether it's a neural network and each node is an event. What we call it might change, but there's always going to be a distributed and consolidated solution.
So is the blockchain too restrictive in its structure? That it's not going to be applicable, and naturally something else is going to come in, some event-based architecture?
Well, I think if you look at the problems that it has, it's onboarding. You have to teach someone, you have to tell someone what blockchain is before they can engage with it. And that's so that doesn't really work.
Do you have an hour? Let me tell you about money.
Yeah. You have to be an amateur economist, and in fact, most people that are into this space are beyond amateur. They're actually really skilled economists. Tokenomics, in and of itself, is a DAO a good use case for running a community? Well, learn tokenomics, and so the learning curve is massive.
Yeah.
And so that's always the elephant in the room is that the community is moving forward at great speed, but there's a massive bunch of people being left behind. And so an all-inclusive solution is really what we should be aiming for.
Yeah, I like how you said that. We should be aiming for an all-inclusive solution. I'm of the belief that there's room for heaps of stuff. We can have a lot of everything. These days, as you work with founders, I'm sure most of them are small groups, especially when you get started. It doesn't take that many brains to put a concept out there. And if you open source it, if you publish it, then that's it. It's been released. And so in that sense, there's going to be lots of opportunity for new things to come along. I appreciate you when I heard you say, I don't think blockchains they're not the end solution to our monetary problems.
No, they're not, but they're definitely a bridge. Absolutely are going to be a bridge and an essential component to take us into the future. There's no doubt about that. And I don't see it as an abrupt ending. I see it as a graceful transition into something that is potentially doesn't need to evolve and develop any further, because it is entirely trustless, because the singularity is moated, because we can trust an autonomous factory and the robots in it. We know they're not going to turn on us. that's kind of, when you think of the singularity, that's what we think about, right? It's that tipping point whereby, the intelligence has sovereignty over its own code base, and it's reconciling its own conflicts. And there's probably a unified language that it's coding itself in that a human being could never understand. And so I think just being honest about what that looks like, scary in context of us not ushering it in properly, but very, very exciting in context of doing it properly.
Do you think we're accelerating towards tech singularity, like an AI singularity?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's potentially already here, but distributed across.
Well, that's the next question, right? Is can you recognize it as it's happening?
It is very, it's hard to imagine that it's not already here, but it's limited by the programmed biases of human beings. But to think that there's not some radical human beings with models and bunkers testing things would be pretty naive.
I mean, the exponential nature of things is pretty stark. And if you zoom out on an exponential curve, it just looks like a step change to an asymptote. And if you're in the smooth part, the elbow, like one of the best examples is like human population on Earth, right? Like nothing happened, and then boom.
Yep.
And you don't know that though until you have the perspective to be able to zoom out and be like, oh, hang on, nothing happened for millennia, or we were busy doing our thing. And I think general consensus is that tech kind of accelerates a lot of the stuff.
For sure. And I think, talking about tokenomics, I think how we incentivize the behavior of a market is an essential component of how we succeed and how quickly, exponentially we grow. If we're incentivized to share our knowledge and wisdom rather than to hold it close to our chest and sell it to people, then we're not going to grow as fast as what we could otherwise. But there has to be some kind of leverage, in growing your reputation as an asset in that scenario. So I think if we hit that sweet spot, we could see a real ramp up of the sharing of knowledge and wisdom and an economy based on incentivizing people to do it that way, grow their mana.
Yeah, bring it on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell me about 11.5625%? I worked it out. It's 11 and 9/16 as a fraction.
Yep. It's so 10% is this constant. So my career has been in taking an asset approach to managing a portfolio of assets, whether those are customers, whether they're the goods and services in a company. And my job is to yield a surplus of that portfolio. I've got a team of portfolio managers. Their job is to have a smaller piece of that portfolio to yield a result. And so I've got a blueprint I've been experimenting with for a long time on how to make that run autonomously and to self-regulate,
sure,
of course.
Okay, yeah.
And so what I came to discover is that there is a sweet spot in terms of the attention. So I found a link between the attention of the portfolio manager into understanding the issue preventing an asset from appreciating. And so solely focused on unearthing that. And so when I remove all the obstacles and barriers preventing your attention from unearthing the obstacle to the appreciation of the asset, something just clicks into place. So for a portfolio manager, if they have a sales support person, if they have a better system, it's free. If I'm always buying back their attention. And then once I've got all their attention, I'm seeking to structure the attention in a way where their exploring and discovery is super refined and efficient. Once you get this going like a well-oiled machine,
yeah.
And then the portfolio manager has self-sovereignty over their own attention, so they then use it as an asset. They got a sales target they need to hit, so they might peg off at the beginning of the month, but they know they've got a target to hit and then ramp it up. Once they've earned the right to have that sovereignty, that self-sovereignty, there's a homeostasis that just settles in at a 10% yield. Now that that 1/16th, I talk about that as innovation, where the innovation happens. And so if you're devoting 1.5%, 5625% to that, then that's the expansion. The rate of, and my hypothesis is that that's the rate of expansion of, any over unity system by default through pure observation, without action. And so if you look at a vortex, if you look at the mathematics around it, if you take a square and you split it in half, if you take a singularity, make it dualistic by splitting it in half, then you draw another one, split that in half, keep splitting. It's infinite, and you find that there's an over unity of 1.5625.
Just to recap here, so 10%, that's sort of like your standard over unity in order to achieve surplus, and then the little extra bit, that's where the innovation happens.
Yeah, that's the unknown.
And that's kind of like that's quite positive that it's not like you need another 100% attention or another sort of inattainable amount of concentration. But if you can sustain or have just a little bit more, then you're seeing.
Yep. But the key is that it has to come from a surplus. If you do it from a deficit, then you're putting your survival at risk.
Okay, so if you're always catching up,
yeah,
then it's no good.
And that, biologically, that flips you into fight or flight, rather than wealth. And, wealth is, to my mind, is to understand that you live in binary and that there is lack of things, but to maintain a surplus that has, that means if there is a black swan event, then you're going to survive. If you never question your survival, then your curiosity will just bubble to the surface, and you can explore that to the tune of 1.5625. I mean, it's a hypothesis. I'll never prove it right or wrong. But I've had experience creating over unity systems in workplaces, and that's what I've discovered.
Well, maybe you won't prove it. Maybe somebody else will.
Yeah, it's possible. You never
know. So presently you are with Callaghan. You mentioned Callaghan already. Callaghan is a member of Blockchain New Zealand. I think they're probably a member of all of NZ Tech. What do you see as like the value add role to being a member of an organization such as Blockchain Tech and such as Blockchain New Zealand? And perhaps that's how I met you originally. I'm not sure. I don't remember, but in terms of being members of these various groups, how do you see that as being beneficial?
I think the huge benefit is your ability to influence at a high level, and I think you have a lot of credibility and smarts, and you can be impartial, and a genuinely impartial voice that is heard and respected in the ecosystem. So we obviously want to amplify and accelerate everything that you're doing, because you can cast that all-encompassing lens across the ecosystem and see what needs to be reconciled between parties. And I think, I think you cast that really high-level lens at a very high level. And I think that works great in a symbiotic way with Callaghan, where we are a government agency, but we are biased by the acceleration of a founder's innovation. And so that's kind of feels more bottom up.
Yeah.
And you guys are more top down, and we kind of meet in the middle, So that's kind of how I see it in my mind. And I think we're getting better at collaborating and figuring out where the right space is. But yeah, that's the benefit I can see.
Coming to the end of our time here, I just have 2 rapid fire questions
Sure.
for you. You don't have to answer them rapidly if you don't want. Mm-hmm. So the first one is philosophical. Do we have free will? Or you can tie it into sovereignty.
Well, I'll tie it into Ternary.
Okay.
Yes and no. So there is a beginning and there is an ending to everything. Within that, so that's deterministic. you're going to die. The universe is going to end. So there is an ending. We know it. So that's deterministic. So in that scenario, destiny is real. You're destined to return to nothing. So we already know that we have a destiny. Free will is the space in between. And so how we navigate our path to that is totally down to us. We have that agency. And it's kind of the same way, I always look at the human body. It has a unified voice. Each cell has sovereignty and agency. It works together symbiotically, perfectly. And yet, I determine the ending, the decisions that I make, really. But the space in between, each individual cell is self-determining for itself. So, yeah, the answer is both. Ternary.
Last question for you today. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto?
I think it's a founder I'm working with now.
Yeah.
When you think about it, if it's not a real person, doesn't even exist, that's a masterstroke for whoever came up with the persona, because it diverts your attention away from every other possibility.
Yeah.
And the narrative around it is so big and powerful now. It's just, if you wanted to distract people's attention from the true source, that would be an ingenious way to do it. The question I have is, did he, if he exists, have the foresight to envisage what it could have become? Because if so, that's a level of genius, it's incredible.
Yeah, unbelievable. Yeah, difficult to parse.
Yeah. And so I marvel at it, really, and it's a nice thing to believe in when you think about it.
Yeah, it's a very nice origin story for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
David, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks, mate.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Look out for the next episode of the BlockchainNZ podcast, probably in the same spot you found this one. Cheers.